I didn't expect to start the new year in a hospital waiting room, mascara streaking down my face and the taste of champagne gone sour in my mouth. It wasn't even my emergency. I had just met him, Eli, barely an hour before, while fireworks exploded above the city skyline and strangers kissed like we'd all survived the apocalypse. But somehow, here I was, clutching his blood-stained jacket and feeling the sharp ache of adrenaline fade into something worse, dread. It wasn't supposed to go like this. We'd locked eyes across a packed balcony as the countdown hit 10, and something electric had passed between us, the kind of pull that made me think maybe the universe wasn't as chaotic as it seemed. He'd smiled, smirked, and handed me a sparkler, saying something cheesy like, "Here's to starting fires." I should have known then that fire attracts chaos. We'd both been at the same party by coincidence, or so I thought. A mutual friend introduced us, a casual clink of glasses, and within minutes, it felt like I'd known him forever. Eli had this easy charm, the kind that makes you forget you've just met someone. He wasn't drop-dead gorgeous, but there was something in his lopsided grin and the way he leaned in like he really cared about my answer when he asked what I wanted out of the night. Something unforgettable, I'd said, not knowing how dangerously close to the truth that would be. Just after midnight, we'd slipped out onto the streets, laughing and dodging fireworks being set off by reckless teens. He grabbed my hand when a firecracker went rogue, pulling me close, and I felt a spark that wasn't just from the explosion. But the night turned dark fast, literally. We rounded a corner into an alley, looking for quiet away from the chaos, and that's when I saw the first flicker of panic in Eli's eyes. A guy was waiting there, lurking, his face half lit by the dull glow of a dying firework. Eli froze, and in that moment, I realized this wasn't some random detour. "What the hell is going on?" I asked, but before I got an answer, the guy lunged. There was shouting, scuffling, and then the crack of a bottle breaking. Too loud, too close. When I blinked, Eli was slumped against the wall, blood dripping from his hand, and the other guy had bolted, leaving behind nothing but the shattering silence of disbelief. For a moment, I couldn't move. It was like the world had frozen in the dim, flickering light of the street lamp, the sound of distant fireworks muffled by the pounding in my ears. "Eli!" I shouted, my voice cracking. He groaned, clutching his side, and I finally sprang into action. My hands trembled as I pulled him upright, his weight collapsing onto me like he'd already given up. "We need to get you help," I said, more to convince myself than him. His lips twisted into that same damn smirk, but now it was tinged with pain. "It's not as bad as it looks," he muttered, wincing, but when I pulled my hand away from his side, it was slick with blood. I felt a wave of nausea but swallowed it down. The night wasn't about me anymore. I had no idea who that guy was, why he'd attacked, or what kind of mess Eli had dragged me into. But one thing was clear. We couldn't stay there. We stumbled out of the alley and into the chaos of the street, where the celebration hadn't stopped for anyone's personal tragedy. Horns honked, laughter spilled from bars, and another round of fireworks crackled overhead. I flagged down the first cab I saw, practically throwing Eli inside before the driver could protest. "Hospital," I snapped, and when the guy hesitated, probably worried about cleaning blood out of his back seat, I pulled a wad of cash from Eli's jacket and tossed it up front. Eli groaned beside me, leaning his head against the window, his breaths coming shallow and fast. "Who was that guy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but Eli shook his head. "Not here," he murmured, his eyes fluttering shut. The hospital wasn't far, but it felt like an eternity. Every bump in the road made Eli wince, and I kept glancing at him, terrified he'd pass out before we got there. When we finally arrived, I jumped out, yelling for help like I was in some over-the-top drama. Nurses swarmed, pulling Eli onto a gurney and rushing him inside. I wasn't even sure if I was allowed to follow, but no one stopped me, maybe because I looked just as wrecked as he did. As they wheeled him away, I realized I was still clutching his jacket, my fingers brushing against something hard in the pocket. Curious and desperate for answers, I reached in and pulled out a key. Not just any key. It was old, tarnished, and intricately designed, like something out of a Victorian novel. What the hell was Eli doing with something like this? Before I could dwell on it, a nurse returned, asking me to fill out forms. "Are you family?" she asked, her tone brisk, and I hesitated. I'd known this guy for all of 2 hours, but the thought of leaving him alone here made my stomach churn. "I'm his boyfriend," I lied, the words tumbling out before I could think. The nurse didn't blink, just handed me a clipboard and left. Sitting there under the fluorescent lights, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptic, I turned the key over in my hand. It felt heavy, important, like it held answers to questions I wasn't sure I wanted to ask. I stared at that key, its cold weight in my palm anchoring me in a situation that felt anything but real. My mind raced, trying to connect dots that didn't yet exist. Who was the guy in the alley? Why had Eli frozen like he'd seen a ghost? And what the hell was so important about this key that he'd carried it like a secret pressed close to his heart? Before I could spiral too far, the nurse returned, her face tight with concern. "He's stable for now," she said, but the relief I felt was short-lived. "He's asking for you." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. For me? The lie about being his boyfriend suddenly felt like a noose tightening around my neck, but I nodded and followed her down the sterile hallway, the key burning a hole in my pocket. Eli looked pale under the harsh hospital lights, a stark contrast to the vibrant, cheeky guy I'd met just hours ago. His eyes fluttered open as I approached, and for a moment, his gaze softened. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Of course I stayed. I shot back, trying to sound nonchalant, but my chest felt tight. What the hell is going on, Eli? Who was that guy? And why do I have this? I held up the key, and his reaction was immediate, a flicker of panic that made my blood run cold. "You weren't supposed to," he started, but his voice faltered. "Eli, talk to me," I urged, leaning in. "I can't help you if I don't know what I'm dealing with." He exhaled shakily, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to grab the key but didn't have the strength. "The guy in the alley, his name's Marco," Eli admitted, his words slow and deliberate. "I owed him something I couldn't give." He paused, his eyes darting away from mine like he was searching for an escape that didn't exist. "The key," I pressed, holding it up again. "What does it open?" For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer, but then he sighed, the fight draining out of him. "It's a safety deposit box," he said, his voice barely audible. "Inside, there's something I stole from Marco, something he'd kill to get back." The room seemed to tilt as his words sank in. "You stole from him?" "Eli, what the hell were you thinking?" I couldn't keep the frustration out of my voice, but beneath it was fear that I'd gotten tangled in something far bigger and darker than a wild New Year's fling. Eli's face twisted in regret. "I didn't have a choice," he said, his voice cracking. "It was either that or—" He didn't finish, but he didn't have to. The weight of his desperation hung heavy in the air. Suddenly, the key felt less like a mystery and more like a ticking time bomb, and I was holding it. Before I could respond, the door burst open, and 2 men in cheap suits stepped inside. My stomach flipped as they flashed badges. "We need to speak to Mr. Cross," one of them said, his tone clipped. Eli's eyes widened, his face paling even more. "Don't say a word," he hissed at me, his voice urgent. The men turned to me, their expressions unreadable. "And you are?" one of them asked. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "I'm his boyfriend," I said again, the lie rolling off my tongue more convincingly this time. If they doubted me, they didn't show it. But the way they looked at Eli, like they already knew his secrets, told me one thing. This night was far from over. The men didn't leave. Instead, they closed the door behind them with a quiet click, and I felt my pulse spike. One of them, a tall, gaunt figure, stepped closer to Eli's bed, his eyes scanning the room like he was deciding whether to search us both for answers or break us down with questions. "Mr. Cross," he began, his voice deceptively calm, "we know about the box." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Eli's eyes darted to me, and for the first time, I saw something raw, guilt, fear, and maybe even a little bit of anger. But mostly, there was something I hadn't expected: resignation. He knew what was coming. The other agent, shorter but with a presence that made my skin crawl, glanced at me and then at the key in my hand, still clenched tightly in my fist. "You've been holding on to that for too long," he said, his voice low but laced with menace. "You know what's inside, don't you?" His eyes bored into mine like he could see every thought swirling in my head. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't wanted to know anything about what Eli had stolen or why it was worth killing over. But now, as these strangers zeroed in on me, I realized that whatever was locked in that box was tied to everything that had happened tonight. And everything that would happen next. I glanced at Eli, searching for some clue, some way out of this. "I don't know what's in it," I lied, the words slipping out of me without hesitation. I don't know why he's involved in this. Why are you even here?" My voice sounded more desperate than I intended, but the agent didn't flinch. "Mr. Cross," the gaunt one repeated, "you've been a liability long enough. You stole from people who don't take kindly to thieves." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "The people who want that key, they don't ask questions. They get answers by any means necessary. And tonight, you've given them exactly what they wanted." Eli's chest tightened as he tried to sit up, but the pain in his side made him wince. "You're making a mistake," he gasped, his voice weak but determined. "I didn't steal from anyone. I was set up. I've been trying to get rid of the damn thing for weeks." The agent didn't seem convinced. His face was unreadable, but something about the way he glanced at his partner told me they weren't buying Eli's story. "You're not fooling anyone," the shorter one said, his tone almost bored. "We know who you've been working with. Marco was just a middleman. The people who own that box. They'll come for you. And when they do, we won't be here to protect you." I felt a sickening chill creep up my spine as I turned the key over in my hand. Suddenly, the noise of the fireworks outside seemed far away, irrelevant to the terror building inside me. These men weren't just law enforcement. They were connected to something darker, something that reached far beyond the alleyway where Eli had been attacked. I could feel it in my gut now. This was bigger than a robbery. This was about a dangerous world Eli had been sucked into, and whether I liked it or not, I was in too deep to back out. What had started as a wild New Year's Eve had turned into a nightmare, and I had no idea how to wake up. Eli's face softened as he looked at me, his eyes filled with a silent apology. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," he murmured, his voice breaking. "This was never meant to touch you." But it was too late. As the agents stepped closer, I felt the cold grip of fate tightening around us. Whatever was in that box, whatever Eli had been running from, had found us, and the fireworks outside were nothing compared to the explosion that was about to go off in our lives. The door slammed open again, this time not with the soft click of authority, but with a violent force that made the walls shake. 3 more figures entered, 2 of them tall, imposing men in dark suits, and one, a woman, clad in a sleek leather jacket, her eyes sharp and predatory, like a wolf sensing weakness. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt an overwhelming surge of panic. These weren't just agents anymore. These were the people Eli had been running from, the ones who made Marco seem like a child playing dress-up in the criminal world. I felt like I was caught in a tide I couldn't escape, drowning in lies, confusion, and the weight of something I couldn't even comprehend. The woman moved with an unnerving calm, her eyes locking onto the key in my hand as she approached. "You're still holding it," she said, her voice smooth but chilling, like the blade of a knife slowly edging toward your skin. "You have no idea what you're holding, do you?" Her words felt like a puzzle piece I wasn't ready to understand, and my gut twisted with the realization that the fireworks, the chaos, the madness, it had all been a distraction. This was what Eli had been running from. The woman stood in front of me now, her gaze never wavering, her lips curling into a half smile. "It's a key to something much bigger than you, and a lot more dangerous. The people who want it back, they don't forgive mistakes. And right now, you're a mistake." I swallowed, the key now feeling like an anchor pulling me deeper into something I couldn't see. I didn't ask for this," I stammered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I looked at Eli, hoping he'd say something, anything, to explain this new level of danger we were facing, but he just met my gaze with those tired, regret-filled eyes. "You don't get to choose," the woman said, cutting through the silence like a whip. "You're already involved. You will make it out of here, but you won't leave the same way you came in. Not without consequences." Her eyes flickered to the agents still standing by the door, their expressions unreadable. They had stepped back, giving her the space to control the situation. Then, in a moment of absolute chaos, everything shifted. A sudden explosion of sound, shattering glass, loud voices, a burst of screams, and I was yanked from the bed where I'd been standing. My body slammed against the cold, tile floor of the hospital hallway. My ears rang. My vision blurred. The woman's face was the last thing I saw before everything went black. The key still clutched in my hand as if it had become part of me. When I woke up, the sterile smell of the hospital was gone, replaced by the heavy, damp scent of rain and smoke. I blinked, confused, and tried to sit up, but my body screamed in protest. The sound of distant sirens cut through the haze in my mind, but something was different. The air felt thick, oppressive, like I was being watched, like I was no longer in control. I turned my head, and there was Eli standing by the window, his back to me, staring out at the night. He wasn't alone. 2 men in black suits stood by his side. "Eli," I whispered, my voice hoarse, and when he turned, I saw it, the change in his eyes. He wasn't the guy I'd met hours ago. That spark, that light was gone. In its place was a darkness, something I couldn't understand but couldn't deny. "We're not leaving this life," Eli said, his voice flat, devoid of anything resembling the man I thought I knew. "The fireworks were just the beginning, and you'll have to decide which side of this war you want to be on." And just like that, the world I thought I understood shattered into 1,000 pieces, each one a reflection of a choice I wasn't sure I was ready to make. The key was still in my hand, but I wasn't holding it anymore. It was holding me, and the fireworks inside, the ones that started this crazy, wild night, were far from over. They were only just beginning.